Hello and welcome to another honest conversation with Charlotte Dixon. And today is actually our penultimate episode for this series. And so, Eve, it's so great to have you on just in time before we're closing off. We will take a break and then we'll be back on. But especially with all the interesting writing you've been doing recently around AI. But without further ado, Eve Poole, lovely to have you on. I'm so excited. I hear you've got an OBE for your services in education and in gender equality. So, which I feel like I would love to have a whole nother conversation with you about that. But before we get so sidetracked, I'd love to hear from you just a little bit about you and your how you've come to be discussing AI.
Well, I it's a bit difficult to describe because I do kind of lots of things. I am a charity chairman and trustee, and I teach leadership and I write books. And I'm a mum. So I do quite a few different things. But I suppose the reason I got into AI in particular was because my professional background is as a theologian. My PhD was in theology and capitalism, so I've written quite a lot about big systems, whether it's theology or capitalism or leadership or, any of those other things, consumerism that I've been writing about. And I suppose that my professional background teaching leadership in a business school also means that I'm really worried about whatever leaders are worried about. And at the moment, a lot of leaders are really worried about AI. So I decided that because I can do systems thinking and I do have some philosophical smarts from the theology degree, it might be quite useful to try and get a different sort of handle on AI to try and figure out, amidst all the noise, amidst all the stuff that comes in every day about it's doing this, it's doing that, we're all toast, whatever, is this is something sensible we can say about this, and how might leaders grapple with what is a very enormous and difficult topic? So I wrote a book called Robot Souls a couple of years ago about that, and I've been doing quite a lot of talking since then around what that means and particularly what it means for leaders.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I think I'm so aligned with you on this because I feel like I'm having loads of conversations, and people who have listened to this series before will have already heard me say, like, I feel like giving everyone this sense of reassurance that everyone thinks everyone else is so ahead of the game compared to
Yeah.
them, and actually they're not. And even AI, I sort of thought when I started this series that where we are now, sort of 5 months later, we would be saying, oh, yeah, things are so much clearer and everything's, makes sense. And we know how to fit it into our work and our life balance. And actually, I think if anything, it's more complicated and there's more noise, which is, I think, why it's probably so important to continue these conversations.
Mhm.
But where do you feel things are at now with AI in terms of managing in
Well, in some ways, I mean,
in
I
the
wrote this book.
workplace?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I wrote the manuscript because it came out in 2024. So that's a good couple of years ago, this Robot Souls thing. And so I must have written the manuscript, 3 and a bit years ago now. And I remember between writing it and submitting it and getting the proofs back for copy editing, ChatGPT came out for the first time as a sort of general consumer thing. And I suppose since then, we've all had stuff in our inboxes every day telling us all about all the features and all of the achievements and all the thresholds and milestones. And you do have to remember that pretty much all the AI in the world is held in capitalist organizations who are excellent at marketing.
Yeah.
And in a world where we're all in a complete panic about the future and particularly financial sustainability, anything that looks like it's going to save corporations a huge amount of cash is going to be automatically really interesting. And given that in service economies, most of your costs are staff, then anything that would cut staff is going to be good news to shareholders. So there seems to be a sort of huge enthusiasm for an assumption that AI will take our jobs. And that is often reported as a negative thing, but actually you can tell from the context, actually, the markets are really giddy about that. They're kind of baking that in because they're assuming that will be, the way that we get over whatever traumas are happening in oil prices and everything else at the moment, and demographic changes and everything else that's going on. And I guess since I wrote the book, because the book is coming from a quite a theoretical place, it's not particularly been dated by all this incredible amount of new stuff coming out, because in some ways the new stuff isn't very new. It is doing the same thing but better and faster and more reliably. And so I'm not sort of that worried about it on one level, because my argument in the book is that it's still missing some quite crucial things that humans and particularly leaders do that are quite important for our general flourishing. And until such a time as, the global apocalypse and AI takes over everything, while you have humans and you still have humans who need leaders and leaders who are leading other humans, then, we're not redundant. But I guess one thing that I think is dawning on people is the systemic disruption that this is going to cause. So I chair a group of schools, and I've also done some strategy work in universities, and they're both contexts where it takes a really long time for anything to change. I mean, if you just think about curriculum change, we've hardly changed what we've been teaching kids since Victorian times. But actually all that grad grind fact stuff, AI has been beating us at that for years. So most of what we've been training kids up in is effectively redundant, and probably has been for really quite some time now. So I think in the circles I'm moving in, there is a growing level of panic, which is really about job security, I guess, at one level, but is also about what are we doing to our kids such that they will be able to flourish in a world where learning facts is going to be absolutely of no use to them whatsoever. And that's actually really linked to what I'm thinking about in terms of what is it that makes leaders good, because it's all about character, it's all about your general humanity, and how we get back in touch with that, because a lot of that has been sort of trained out of us, probably since the Enlightenment, actually. So a lot of the conversations I'm having at the moment. So for instance, with clinicians, the NHS is one of these bodies that knows it's running out of money. And there is a huge amount of pressure because of tax dollar spend to try and make the NHS affordable. So if some, salesman from an AI company comes and says, I can completely cut your costs by giving you this clever gadget, it's going to be a very brave government that says no. But how can you as a clinician get ahead of the game, whether you're working in hospices or therapy or a surgery or a nurse or anything, trauma? How do you get clear about what it is that you actually do that is irreplaceable? Because on the face of it, these days, most things look replaceable by AI because we've not been very particular about what it is we think we're doing. We're just being brainy, intellectual, all those things. We're professionally qualified, all those sorts of labels that we used to have, and assumptions we made in terms of business case of educating our children and sending them to university. Those things won't wash when you have a competitor now who is designed to be more intelligent than we are. So you now have to get quite granular about what is it you actually do that adds value, so that you can gladly delegate all that other stuff to AI, because that's going to be efficient, and figure out how do you really double down on the stuff that really matters and really makes a difference.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's so interesting because we've got artificial intelligence, which is artificial. And when people think about intelligence traditionally, they did think about academically. But if anything, my career has taught me is that actually emotional intelligence is just as equally important. And it's one of those things, I remember having conversations years ago about recruitment and the importance of values-led recruitment, because you can have somebody that's incredibly knowledgeable, but if they can't work as a team, you're going to really struggle to have them sort of functioning within the team in a really helpful way. And it sort of just makes me think, right now, a lot of the conversations I seem to be having with people are very much, it's like the conversation has shifted a little bit from how intelligent is AI and what can it do, to how are we valuing the human elements of the work environment and of work itself, and how are we making sure people recognize them enough to not think that they can replace them with AI, because I don't think they can.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I've just been writing a thing that I think helps kind of tease this out a bit, which is using French and German words for knowing to explain what it is AI can do easily and what AI struggles to do. So if you remember doing French and German at school, in French, there's a difference between savoir and connaître. And that's a similar difference in German between wissen, and kennen. So kennen and connaître are all about me knowing you as a person, whereas the savoir and the wissen is all about me knowing about you, facts, the OBE, the books, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And we've kind of lost that way of distinguishing in our own language between types of knowing. But if you think about it, all that sort of wissen and savoir is all the book stuff that you can email each other and you can share it around, and it's kind of objective facts and data that is very fungible. And humans have always translated, transmitted that stuff. That's kind of what we do. But if you think about an example of fake news, it's quite hard to spot fake news because it's expressed as savoir and wissen. It's kind of laid out like facts on a website or on a newspaper page or on your phone or whatever. But if we have a person in front of us and we're worried about fake news, we're worried about lying, because your connaître and your kennen is kicking in, which is your subjective ways of knowing another person, you're immediately scanning for, is this normal? Are they looking a bit weird? Are they treating me funny? Are they not holding my gaze? Are they playing with their earlobes? Whatever it might be that you think are tells for lying. You've just got a lot more data because of that way of knowing. And it's one of these ways in which we tend to most trust knowing is, well, people will tell us something, like a CV will come in and we think that looks pretty smart, but we'll still want to interview the person because then, your wissen and your savoir gets kind of double marked by your kennen and your connaître, and because you've seen it with your own eyes, you sort of felt it in your bones, you trust that you know that person now. So I think one way of sort of de-panicking the AI thing is thinking, well, of course, we've designed it to be totally whizzy, fantastically super info and facts and all that stuff. So we shouldn't be surprised if it's really, really, really very good at that. But the thing that it can't do currently, even embodied in a skeleton, because that will drive a certain amount of mechanical self-awareness. But until we are convinced there is some sort of consciousness in play, that sort of embodied way of knowing is something which is very particular to us and is crucial, as you say, for leading.
Yeah. And I do think it's one of those things, until AI can, like, as you say, like on an informational level, that AI can match us, but until AI can sit in front of somebody and recognize the nuance of the tone of voice, their body language, their facial expressions, I think humans don't have that much to worry about because I think all of that is so important.
Even if they can, I mean, Wittgenstein had a really nice throwaway line about this because he talked about, I'm responding to you as though you have a soul. He says, not as an automaton, but as though you have a soul. And I think there is something interesting because even like robotic vacuum cleaners are figuring out not to hoover up the cat, not to go down the stairs and things. There is a certain amount of sort of self-awareness that's programmed in for their functionality. And so we're already programming care bots and all kinds of other AIs to be able to sort of pick up if we're looking gloomy or happy or sad or our voice is wobbling or, there's a huge amount of that stuff you can kind of code in because you can turn it into information. But there is something about our very, very deep intuition about other persons which at the moment we just have more smarts on because they are such ancient properties of ours that have kept the species going for so long, we don't even understand them. But we do understand them when they're telling us something quite loudly in our ear, that we trust that person or we don't trust that person. Even though we're not really quite sure where that information is coming from, we absolutely know it in our bones.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I was going to say, because even these personality tests we have, them start off with Myers-Briggs, and then now people know it's DISC, and in Scotland it's Insights, and actually Facet 5 is really good. But somebody recently reached out to me and said, as a psychologist, can you just fact check this for me, because I did this test and I feel like it doesn't quite represent me. And I said to them, these tests can be really valuable, and they are really valuable, and they're really helpful. They give people a shared language of how to think about or talk to their colleagues and how to think about themselves in relation to their colleagues and notice the differences and similarities and how to work around some of those differences. But ultimately, they are developed from somebody's best attempt at sort of translating psychological theory, and psychological theory is somebody's best attempt at translating the human mind and how we work. And it is, although they are valuable, they are someone's best attempts. They're not necessarily, they're theory, they're not fact. Really, we can't say categorically they're fact, because humans are so complex that you can't do cause and effect testing really to that level of depth when it comes to our psychology and the human brain. So I think it's so, and I think AI is the same really. Like you say, we don't know really we couldn't totally be completely sure how the human brain works and all the nuances and all that gut instinct. There is no.
But I think one of the things that we do need to be very, very clear about is this has caught us napping, in that all the things that we had been prizing over the last few hundred years, all this brainiac stuff, we're toast on that. And I think we had been systematically, particularly through our education systems, downplaying all that fuzzy stuff, all that EQ stuff, all that intuition, all that humanity, because we wanted people who could get A stars and go to Oxbridge. So I think, on the one hand, we don't need to worry, but we do need to worry a lot about the fact that we have not been nurturing and paying attention to our basic humanity very well. And we haven't been prizing it and incentivizing people to pay attention to it and improve it and get good at it. And we haven't been protecting those institutions whose jobs it is to help us with all that stuff. So I do think that it's really important that leaders, while they should not panic, they should sort of panic in a managed fashion around how they're going to make sure that people around them are getting the investment, the time, the information they need to be able to start really doubling down on all that stuff that we had been taught to ignore and taught to think was, immature or girly or spooky or whatever we thought. Just because we can't define it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And this is the problem about consciousness. Everyone's in such a fizz because they can't nail it down, but you can't airbrush it out. So there is something about all this stuff, which is the reason we're still here. We need to figure out pretty sharpish, how would we rescue that? How would we understand it? How would we improve it? How would we train it? How would we teach it? How do you learn it? All of that stuff. So one of the lovely conversations about the leaders is saying, well, look, when I wrote my big leadersmithing book, it was all based on this question to C-suite leaders: what do you know now that you wish you'd known 10 years ago? And most leaders would immediately snap back, I wish I'd known to trust my gut. But if you think about that, if you ask a leader last time they trust their gut, they spent the whole time fighting, thinking, I don't have the data and I really must check and I mustn't, that might be bias, all that. But actually, if you get them to a timeline about leadership highs and lows, you can bet your bottom dollar before the last low, they did have a bit of an intuition. They did have a bit of a spooky voice or a dream or something going on, which they brushed aside because they thought, I'm far too grown up, I've got an MBA, what are you on about? And so there is something about how do we factor that back in, and how do we get leaders to be able to hear that louder than they have been able to do? And also, how do you get leaders to be incredibly particular about what is it that makes you good in that situation? Because it's not just that you have got 10 years experience. I mean, what does that actually mean? It's because there's some stuff you're picking up that may not be obvious to other people. And you're picking that up through your emotions, through your intuition, through being able to sit in uncertainty longer than other people, being curious about stories and meaning making, all these kinds of things, which we all thought was junk code. All that stuff is the reason you're really good. And the more quickly we can be obsessed with why we're actually adding value, the more we can try and figure out, well, how did I learn that then? And therefore, how could we teach this, and where could other people learn it from?
Brilliant. And that was going to be my next question, actually, is if there are leaders or teams sitting here listening to this thinking, yeah, but where do we start? What would be your one bit of advice?
Well, I have a TED talk all about junk code, and it is really about starting with that. It's about trying to be clear about the things that really, really make you human. Now, you can start from my list of junk code and have a look at that, or you can think, well, what about those highs and lows? When have I been absolutely at my best as a leader, for instance? What was going on? What was I drawing on? What did I notice? What made me better than other people would have been in that situation? What was the particularity of it? And trying to tease that out, that starts helping you figure out what was it that overwhelmingly meant you flourished there. because it was probably a superpower which is less tangible than you might have imagined. It wasn't just because you've got the MBA and all those years of experience. It was because you spotted something which was possibly something to do with someone else who'd done that, or a memory you've got of, or a kind of instinct, or any of those things. And it's relearning how to trust that stuff as data. So some of it is just trying to go back to basics about what makes you human. And it's almost sort of ignoring the intelligence bit such that we have learnt it, because we have to assume we have to kind of imagine that AI can beat us on most of that stuff now. But for instance, there's probably a time when you spotted something no one else saw, because one thing humans are really good at is seeing what's not there. AI finds that very hard because it's all to do with data sets, and it's all to do with pre-existing data sets. And it can extrapolate, and there might be a gap in a sequence, like Hume's missing shade of blue, that it could confabulate about in a truthful or untruthful way. But it can't, do an Einstein and get on the back of a wave of light, a ray of light, and see where it goes. It can't kind of imagine a story that could be written. So I think, as well as thinking about the very human kind of connectory things, it is about thinking about the cognitive things that allow us to see novelty, to see gaps, to see things that AI can't see because it's having to, particularly the large language models, it is all about tokens and pattern recognition. So novelty, it could extrapolate, it could do that sort of creativity and innovation, but there's lots of other creativity and innovation that aren't really available to it, that are still available to humans.
What I find so interesting is that when we talk about this, we talk about using your instincts as data, but data, the word data itself, is such a technology sort of, in the context, that's such a technological word, like maybe 50 years ago.
Maybe it's a resource. Maybe it's about thinking about it as a genuine and truthful resource. I mean, I think.
Yeah, I'm not criticizing it, because I think in a way it sort of speaks to the fact that organizations value data, and we're taught that is the ultimate. It's sort of the ultimate test or fail, isn't it? What your data speaks. So it is I think you're completely right. It is resource, but it's funny that we even use the sort of computer, as it were, language to talk about our own intelligence now, because that's what's valued. It shows what's valued in our society.
Absolutely, you've got to have a business case for everything, don't you?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's partly our kind of left brain obsession, but it is also our sort of what we have built AI to be, which is to be an incredible machine for rational, objective thinking. And we know there's also subjective thinking, which we have then assumed as irrational. But I think when you look at the way other languages keep objective and subjective knowing as different categories, they know that subjective knowing is not falsehood. And there may be some stuff that comes in there that can muddy the waters, because we all have to go on our unconscious bias training and be very, very clear that sometimes your gut feel might have some other stuff going on in there. But it doesn't mean your gut feel is entirely wrong. It's about being intelligent about it, in the same way that you would interrogate data. If someone was lying to you on, in an academic paper, you would still be curious about that, in the same way that your body might be saying, run away, run away, run away. And sometimes you need to pay attention to that and go, actually, I must run away. Or sometimes it might be, it's only a spider. No need to run away this time.
It's so interesting, actually. I've not really made this connection. I can't believe I haven't made this connection before. But with dialectical behavioural theory, they talk about the wise mind, and it's taking the analytical and the emotional and having both of them in mind, not one or the other. And it's almost like that's where organisations have to sit. They have to sit in the sort of wise mind model, to value both and not ignore either.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, because I remember doing all my coaching training, and there was this completely brilliant, I mean, there were loads of different tools and techniques, obviously, that you were introduced to in that environment, including things like, when you suddenly get an image of a forest in your head, then you should say that, because that might be information for the other person about what is happening in your head that might also be happening in their head. But I remember there was one coaching session where all we had to do was sit with the other person. One was coaching, one was being the coachee, and the coachee had to summon to their mind their problem, and the person coaching had to hold that person energetically for about 5 minutes. And then that person would consider the nature of their problem for those 5 minutes. And then at the end, they would report back on what they decided to do about it. And it was one of the most effective coaching interventions I've seen in my life. And of course, that would fail every kind of rational test because you're not even talking. But there was something about what was going on in that space between those two people that shifted stuff for people. So I think the thing is, we just don't even know. I mean, all the stuff we program into AI is absolutely the least of what we know about anything. I mean, as we're sitting here chatting, our bodies are busy digesting breakfast and figuring out light in the room and controlling vocal cords and breathing and temperature and I mean all kinds of stuff. I mean, if your body is pregnant or has got cancer, it knows long before anybody else does. Because it's busy cracking on with doing whatever it needs to do in response to all that stuff. So, you know, the fact that we've got a little bit of consciousness we're aware of, and we don't know anything about the subconscious and the unconscious really very much, and we've taken a little bit of that, a tiny, tiny top slice of the stuff we are aware of, called it intelligence and turned it into zeros and ones, and everything else is just far too complicated, so we've ignored it. But, you know, we shouldn't be surprised that AI is deficient because it is a sort of bastardized model of our own operating system. And it is deliberately partial because we were trying to optimize it for sort of speed and size and all those kinds of whizzy cool things. But we just need to be really careful about that because if you make something that's designed to be broken, then you shouldn't really be surprised if it breaks.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's about holding the kind of AI hypothesis lightly and thinking, well, we're not done yet because actually we need to be really careful with this thing we've created because it could be really quite dangerous because it is decontextualized. So for leaders, it's all about trying to make sure that you're very, very, very clear about what it is your practice is as a leader so that you can make sure you're incorporating AI into that appropriately, but you're not being completely beguiled by merchandising to think it's going to replace most of your functionality because it can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think again, even the phrase functionality, it feels kind of cold, doesn't it? But that's business, isn't it? That ultimately that is business. It's like proving your worth, and I think
Your
that's
competencies.
exactly that's the position leaders are in right now is like proving their worth over the AI.
Yeah, what are
And
you
I
getting
think
your 360 feedback on? Because it'll all be a big list of clunky things, most of which AI can do. So there's some really interesting stuff here for all of us about what we're measuring such that we're managing it and what would we need to look at differently if we're going to take really seriously this junk code idea that all the stuff actually means that we flourish as a species is all the stuff that's been left on the cutting room floor when it comes to AI. But it is the stuff that will ultimately save our bacon and is at the heart of our competitive advantage as humans. And therefore we need to be really much better at it and take it more seriously.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, it's been so wonderful to talk to you, Eve. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, and I would definitely love to have another conversation at a later date, maybe perhaps in the next series. But thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for listening.